Joining us on the program now, expert in international relations, Professor Robert Patman from Otago University. Robert, kia ora, good morning.
Kia ora, good morning, Andrew.
This has been quite a dramatic week in terms of the Ukrainian peace process. What do we know? What's on the table at the moment, Robert?
Well, it's in its early stages and we haven't had too much detail, but US and Russian diplomats met in Saudi Arabia. And I think it's fair to say that in the preliminaries before the meeting, from Zelensky's point of view, there were some worrying developments. First of all, Ukraine wasn't included in the all-crucial opening meeting, which would frame the peace agenda. Secondly, American diplomats, particularly the Secretary of Defense, Hegseth, and also the J.D. Vance, as well as and also the President himself, all indicated in the build-up to the first meeting that NATO membership would not be possible for the foreseeable future for Ukraine, which has been a key demand of the Zelensky government, and also supported by the EU and most NATO states. The second thing that really ruffled feathers was that Mr. Trump and the Secretary of Defense indicated that there would have to be compromise territorially on both sides. This didn't sit well with the Zelensky government. They made the point that you never enter a negotiation by giving up all your cards in advance. Also, they felt that there was a false moral equivalence between the invading forces and the victim of that aggression, which was Ukraine. And so that the discussions took place on Monday in Saudi Arabia. Mr. Zelensky said that he wouldn't accept any agreed settlement if Ukraine wasn't represented at the discussions. He also said that Europe should be represented. And I think the other thing that's been fueling and exacerbating the tensions around the Trump peace initiative, not only has it been seen as essentially a US-Russian deal by Europe and Zelensky, but Mr. Trump has made some quite inflammatory comments. He's indicated that, in his view, Zelensky is something of a dictator, which was a reference to the fact that the Ukrainian elections due in May last year were cancelled. But of course, Britain cancelled elections during the Second World War because there was a war on. And Zelensky, whose country has been invaded and who was democratically elected by a landslide, by 75%, said that they weren't in any way turning their back on democracy, but they wanted to have elections when there was peace in the country. So there's been, to answer your question, there's a peace process in train, which the Americans and the Russians declare themselves satisfied with. But it's the beginning of a conversation, in the words of Marco Rubio, and it has yet to deliver. There seems to be very few details of what's going to happen.
Of course, this would be a big win for Trump if we could get it across the line. This could also be very good news for Vladimir Putin, of course, if the trade embargo, which is crippling the Russian economy at the moment, if that is lifted, this would be seen as a win for him, especially if he kept most of the territorial gains that the Russian army has achieved over the last 3 years. In some ways, it's a two-part process. Firstly, restoring of relationships between Russia and the United States, and from there, possibly a peace process?
I don't think so. I don't think the Trump approach, with one thing we haven't mentioned, a number of divisions amongst Trump's officials. General Keith Kellogg, the special envoy to Ukraine, has repeatedly said that nothing less than the full restoration of the sovereignty of Ukraine will bring a sustainable peace. But Mr. Trump is saying something quite different. And I noticed overnight General Kellogg's meeting, he traveled to Ukraine to speak to President Zelensky. It was cancelled at the last moment, although Kellogg was physically present at the American request. So presumably there may be some uneasiness now in Washington about the difference of interpretation over the way forward. At different times, Marco Rubio has also been speaking in terms of tone and emphasis quite differently from Mr. Trump, who seems much more to take the view that Ukraine should cede 20% of its country in return for peace. The problem with that formula, of course, that approach is not only is it strikingly at variance with the previous administration, but it's strikingly at variance with international law. Mr. Putin broke core principles of international relations, which concern territorial integrity and state sovereignty. And the other thing is, for someone who describes himself as a strong leader, Mr. Trump has been incredibly weak in dealings with Mr. Putin. After all, this is Russia is not like the Soviet Union. It's not a co-equal superpower. It's a regional power now. It's got an economy about the size of Spain. And why isn't Mr. Trump, as the representative of the most powerful country in the world, demanding that Russia withdraw its troops to the internationally recognized border of Russia?
Let's talk about
this is, I think, causing some consternation.
Let's talk about the European reaction, because there was also a heated meeting with the vice president, with the heads of the European government. And even if the NATO deal is off the table, certainly support from European allies seems to be strengthening, if anything, in the last week or so. If Ukraine loses American support, would there be enough support from European allies to...
Well, Europe's support, despite what Mr. Trump says, has outstripped American support. Europe's given about $138 billion worth in assistance. And American sources confirm this, by the way. This is not me just talking off the top of my head. And according to the Foreign Relations Council, which is widely respected in the United States, America's given round about $110 billion.
Which is still significant. And to be fair, it's still a significant amount of money.
Well, it's very significant.
And to be fair, as Trump has pointed out, the Europeans have got more skin in the game. They've got more to lose. There's a big, beautiful ocean between the United States and what is happening in Europe. Perhaps a signal for the other NATO allies to step up in this regard? Absolutely.
But you see, again, Mr. Trump's moved the goalpost there, because in his first administration, between 2017 to 2020, he wanted all NATO countries to get to 2%. 2/3 of them have now got to 2% of GDP on defense spending. But at the beginning of his second administration, he said that had now gone up to 5%. So he's asking them to contribute 5%. That's not something the United States actually does itself. So there is a concern that Mr. Trump doesn't actually have a constructive view of NATO. But the crucial point is that the Europeans feel excluded. As you rightly said, they are at the sharp end of this. It's their continent. They're worried that if Mr. Putin is allowed to annex 20% of a country illegally, it will embolden him to make further territorial demands, perhaps against the Baltic states.
Now, we are coming up on the 3-year anniversary. With all that has happened in the last week, can you see this resolving anytime soon? It seems more complicated than it was a week ago in some ways, even though steps have been taken towards a negotiated peace. Can you see this being resolved anytime soon, Robert?
Not unless the West is on the same page with Zelensky and the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians will fight on. It's their territory. As the Ukrainian military has said, we've got nowhere to go. And they do not accept the legitimacy of the Russian presence in their country. So Europe will have to step up. if it wants Ukraine to restore its territorial integrity. One thing we haven't discussed that Europeans do have, if America discontinues or disengages from Ukraine, they have $300 billion worth of confiscated assets belonging to the Putin regime.
Yeah.
Sorry, not confiscated assets, assets that have been frozen.
Frozen, yeah.
Since the war. And they could confiscate those assets and make them available to Ukraine. So that's quite a significant amount of money, $300 billion.
Yeah.
The other thing that's interesting is that there are rumors in the last 24 hours that Ukraine is poised for another big counteroffensive at another part of Russia, around Bryansk. And so there could yet be surprises on the battlefield. That I think at the moment, to sum up, the peace prospects don't look particularly promising.
Yeah.
But it's a fast-moving situation, and we could be surprised.
Well, Robert, thank you for your insight and your analysis of what is a very complicated situation. Appreciate your wisdom on this one. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.